The day I found out my father was gone felt like the ground beneath me had vanished. He wasn't just my dad, he was my anchor, my only family. My mom had passed away when I was little, and my dad raised me on his own. He wasn't perfect, but he was mine. And now, he was gone. The funeral was small, just a few close friends and some neighbors. I remember standing there, staring at the closed casket, feeling hollow. Greg, the man who lived next door to my dad for years, was one of the neighbors who came. He approached me after the service, a somber expression plastered on his face. "If you ever need anything, Rachel," he said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity, "you know where to find me. Your dad was a great man. I'm so sorry for your loss." At the time, I thought he was just being polite. I thanked him, my mind too fogged with grief to really think about his words. He'd always been friendly, in a surface-level way. I'd never had a reason to distrust him. For the next couple of weeks, I focused on sorting through my dad's belongings. He'd left everything in order, just as he always promised he would. There was no will, he didn't think it was necessary, since he'd already transferred the deed of the house into my name a few months before his death. He wanted to make things easy for me, to spare me from dealing with legal red tape while I grieved. That was my dad. Always thinking ahead. I spent hours at the house, packing up his things, trying to hold on to the memories. It wasn't just a house to me. It was where I grew up, where I learned to ride a bike, where my dad made pancakes every Sunday morning. It was home. Knowing it was mine was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. A few weeks later, I took the paperwork for the house to the courthouse to finalize everything. I handed the clerk the deed, expecting her to simply process it and confirm that the house was officially mine. Instead, she frowned as she looked over the documents. She said, flipping through the pages. "I think there's been a mistake." My stomach tightened. What kind of mistake? She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "This deed isn't in your name. It's in the name of Greg Olson." For a moment, I thought I must have misheard her. What? That's not possible. My dad transferred the house to me months ago. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice laced with sympathy. "But the records show that the property was sold to Greg Olson 2 months before your father passed." My mind reeled. That can't be right. My dad never sold the house. He wouldn't do that. The clerk hesitated, as if she didn't want to add to my distress. "You might want to speak to Mr. Olson. If there's been an error, he'll need to help you clear it up." I left the courthouse in a daze, the world around me blurring into a haze of disbelief and anger. There had to be some kind of mistake. My dad would never sell the house without telling me. It didn't make sense. When I got to Greg's house, I banged on his door with more force than I intended. He opened it after a moment, his face lighting up with that same insincere smile he always wore. "Rachel." What a surprise. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone overly friendly. "Cut the act, Greg," I snapped, shoving the paperwork toward him. "What is this? Why is your name on the deed to my dad's house?" His smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, that. Your dad and I had an arrangement. He sold me the house a while back. Didn't he tell you?" I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "No, he didn't. Because it didn't happen. My dad would never sell this house. You forged this, didn't you?" Greg's expression hardened, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. "Now, Rachel, I understand you're upset. But you don't have any proof of that. The paperwork is all in order, and the sale was completely legal." "You're lying," I said through clenched teeth. "I don't know how you did this, but I'll find out. You're not getting away with this." Greg shrugged, his demeanor cool and calculated. "You can try, but it's your word against mine. And as far as the law is concerned, the house belongs to me. I left his house shaking with rage, my mind racing with thoughts of how to fight him. I couldn't let him get away with this. I couldn't lose my dad's house, not after everything else I'd already lost. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the fight. I hired a lawyer, gathered every piece of evidence I could find, and spent countless hours trying to prove that Greg had forged the documents. But he'd covered his tracks well. The signature on the contract looked exactly like my dad's, and Greg had even gone as far as to create fake bank records showing a payment for the house. It was a masterclass in deception. I was running out of money and options. My lawyer warned me that without concrete proof, there was little chance of overturning the sale. The courts wouldn't take my word over Greg's, especially not with the paperwork backing him up. One night, as I sat in my tiny apartment surrounded by boxes of legal documents, I broke down. I felt powerless, like the walls were closing in on me. Greg had stolen the one thing I had left of my dad, and there was nothing I could do about it. He was going to win. But then, as I sat there in the dark, something inside me shifted. I realized I was done playing by the rules. If Greg wanted to lie, cheat, and steal to get what he wanted, then I'd beat him at his own game. I wasn't going to let him destroy my life. I was going to destroy his. I didn't waste any time. If Greg was willing to use lies and deception to take what was mine, I would show him what real scheming looked like. This wasn't about forgiveness or moving on anymore. It was about justice, or, if I was honest, revenge. I wasn't just going to get my dad's house back. I was going to make Greg pay for everything he'd done. He thought he was untouchable. I was about to prove him wrong. The first step was learning everything I could about Greg. He liked to keep up appearances, new cars, flashy lawn furniture, extravagant holiday decorations. But I always got the sense he was compensating for something. I started digging, and it didn't take long to uncover his dirty laundry. Greg wasn't some self-made success like he liked to portray. He was drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out. A second mortgage on his house. And, most interestingly, a series of shady investments that he'd poured money into over the years. The deeper I dug, the more I realized Greg wasn't just a liar, he was desperate. And desperation made him sloppy. He frequented online forums for small-time investors, the kind of places where people brag about making it big with questionable get-rich-quick schemes. He was active in several groups, sharing tips on hidden opportunities, and dropping hints about his supposed wealth. It was all smoke and mirrors, but it gave me an idea. If Greg was so eager to find the next big score, maybe I could give it to him. I spent the next few weeks crafting my plan. I created a fake identity, Diane Ross, a wealthy widow with a passion for investing. Diane had an air of mystery about her, the kind of person who didn't need to prove her wealth because it spoke for itself. I set up fake social media profiles, complete with pictures of luxurious vacations, expensive cars, and designer clothes. I even went as far as creating a LinkedIn page with glowing testimonials from former colleagues. Diane was perfect. She was everything Greg wanted to be. I joined the same forums Greg was active in, posting under Diane's name. At first, I kept my distance, posting vague comments and engaging in casual conversations. I needed to establish credibility before I could lure Greg in. But it didn't take long for him to notice me. Men like Greg always noticed women like Diane. One evening, I posted about a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity I'd recently discovered, a fictitious tech company that was poised to disrupt the entire industry. I made it sound exclusive, dropping hints that only a select few investors would have access. Within hours, Greg sent me a private message. "Hi Diane," he wrote. "I couldn't help but notice your post about the investment opportunity. It sounds incredible. Would you be willing to share more details?" I smiled as I read his message. He was practically salivating. I took my time responding, playing hard to get. I told him I was only looking for serious investors, people who could bring something to the table. Greg, of course, assured me he was more than qualified. He bragged about his extensive experience in the investment world and hinted at his financial resources. It was almost too easy. Over the next few weeks, I reeled him in. I sent him fake financial projections, glowing reviews from other investors, and detailed plans for the business. Greg fell for all of it. He was so eager to prove himself that he didn't even question the legitimacy of the information I was feeding him. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to make him work for it, to make him desperate. I told him there was limited space for new investors and that I was considering others who had already expressed interest. Greg panicked. He sent me message after message, begging me to give him a chance. He even upped his initial offer, promising to invest more money if it would secure his spot. Finally, I told him he was in. I sent him a fake contract, complete with legal jargon and signatures from my imaginary partners. He signed it without hesitation and wired $150,000 to the account I'd set up under Diane's name. It was his entire savings, drained in one reckless move. I should have felt guilty, but I didn't. This was the man who had stolen my home, my memories, my father's legacy. He deserved every bit of what was coming to him. But I wasn't finished. I needed to twist the knife, to make sure Greg felt the sting of his own greed. For the next few months, I kept up the charade, sending him regular updates about how well the company was doing. I created fake financial reports showing massive growth, promising him that his investment was about to pay off in a big way. Greg was ecstatic. He started bragging to the neighbors about his brilliant move, acting like he was some kind of financial genius. I watched from the sidelines, quietly biding my time. It wasn't enough to take his money. I wanted him to feel the full weight of his own arrogance, to know that everything he'd built was about to come crashing down. One day, I decided it was time to end the game. I sent Greg an email, posing as Diane, informing him that the company had gone bankrupt. I told him there was nothing left for the investors to recover and that his money was gone. The next day, I blocked him on all platforms and deleted Diane's accounts. Just like that, she disappeared, taking Greg's savings with her. I knew he'd try to contact me, and he did. He left frantic voicemails and sent dozens of emails, begging Diane to respond. When he realized she wasn't coming back, he started to unravel. His smug demeanor vanished, replaced by desperation and fear. He stopped bragging to the neighbors and started avoiding them altogether. It was satisfying to watch, but I wasn't done yet. I wanted him to know exactly who had done this to him. One night, I slipped an envelope under his door. Inside was a copy of the fake contract he'd used to steal my dad's house, along with a note that simply said, "How does it feel?" The next morning, I parked my car a few houses down and watched as Greg found the envelope. His face went pale as he read the note, his hands trembling. He looked around wildly, as if expecting to see me standing there, but I was hidden. He stumbled back into his house, slamming the door behind him. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. This was only the beginning. Greg thought he could ruin my life and walk away unscathed. He was wrong. I was just getting started. Greg wasn't doing well after the collapse of his supposed investment. That much was obvious. Over the next few weeks, I watched his life spiral further and further out of control. The shiny cars in his driveway disappeared one by one, repo men dragging them away in broad daylight. His once perfectly manicured lawn turned into a patchy wasteland. He stopped putting out those gaudy garden gnomes and lights he loved so much. Greg, the man who used to strut around like he owned the world, was now skulking around like a ghost, avoiding neighbors and barely leaving his house. But I wasn't finished yet. Losing his savings was a start, but I wanted Greg to feel the full weight of his actions, not just the financial loss, but the emotional devastation he had caused me. He needed to understand what it felt like to have your life torn apart piece by piece. So, I decided to hit him where it would hurt the most, his reputation. Greg was a man who lived for appearances. Even when he was drowning in debt, he always made sure to act like he was on top of the world. He loved being the center of attention, bragging about his successes and lording his supposed wealth over everyone else. So, I decided to take that away from him, too. I started with the neighborhood. Greg might have been a liar and a thief, but he was still good at playing the role of the charming, successful neighbor. Most people had no idea what he was really like. They saw him as friendly, generous Greg, the guy who hosted barbecues and always had a smile on his face. That image was about to crumble. I created an anonymous email account and began sending messages to people in the neighborhood. I wrote about how Greg had stolen my father's house, attaching copies of the forged contract he had used to do it. I explained how he'd lied and manipulated his way into stealing my inheritance, painting a picture of the real man behind the facade. I didn't sign my name, I wanted the story to speak for itself. The fallout was almost immediate. Within days, whispers started spreading around the neighborhood. People began avoiding Greg, their polite waves turning into cold glares. His friends stopped showing up at his house, and the usual crowd at his backyard barbecues disappeared. Greg was no longer the golden boy of the neighborhood. He was a pariah. But that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure Greg's reputation was ruined beyond the confines of our small community. I turned my attention to his shady, investment schemes. Over the weeks I had been playing him as Diane, I had gathered plenty of information about his dealings, enough to show a clear pattern of fraud and unethical behavior. It wasn't hard to find people he'd burned in the past. A few online forums and social media searches later, I found several of his former business partners, all of whom had stories about how Greg had scammed them out of money or misled them into bad investments. I reached out to them anonymously, sharing what I had learned about Greg's latest scam and encouraging them to come forward. Some of them were hesitant at first, but others were eager to expose him. One man, a retired teacher who had lost his entire pension in one of Greg's schemes, was particularly motivated. Together, we compiled enough evidence to make Greg's life very uncomfortable. We leaked the information online, posting it to every investment forum Greg frequented. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Suddenly, Greg's name was popping up everywhere, linked to words like scammer and fraudster. His social media accounts were flooded with angry messages from people he had wronged, and potential investors started pulling out of deals. Greg's carefully constructed image as a successful investor was crumbling before his eyes. One day, as I sat in my car parked down the street, I saw Greg storm out of his house, his face red with anger. He was on the phone, yelling loud enough that I could hear him even from where I was sitting. I didn't need to hear the details to know what was happening. He was panicking. Everything he had built, his reputation, his connections, his financial future, was falling apart. And he had no idea that I was the one behind it. But even as Greg's life fell apart, I knew he still had one thing left, my father's house. He hadn't sold it yet, probably hoping the market would turn in his favor. That house was the last piece of the puzzle, the final thing tying Greg to his old life. I had to get it back. I decided to go after the buyers. I knew Greg was trying to sell the house to pay off his mounting debts, but I also knew he wouldn't disclose the house's true history. He would lie to potential buyers, just like he lied to everyone else. So, I made sure the truth would come out. Using another anonymous account, I started contacting real estate agents and potential buyers who were interested in the property. I sent them copies of the forged deed and explained how Greg had stolen the house from me. I made it clear that buying the house could land them in a legal mess, warning them to stay far away from the deal. It worked. One by one, the offers fell through. Greg couldn't find a buyer, and with every failed deal, his financial situation got worse. As Greg's debts piled up, the bank finally stepped in. His own house, the one he had lived in for over a decade, went into foreclosure. I watched as the eviction notice was posted on his door, the final nail in the coffin. Greg, who had once flaunted his wealth and success to anyone who would listen, was now homeless and broke. But I wasn't finished. I wanted Greg to know exactly who had orchestrated his downfall. He needed to understand that this wasn't some random string of bad luck, it was me, the woman he had tried to ruin, taking back what was mine. One evening, I returned to my father's house. It was still empty, the "for sale" sign sitting crookedly in the front yard. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding as memories of my dad flooded back to me. I slipped a letter through the mail slot, addressed to Greg. The letter was short and to the point: "You stole from me. You thought you could take everything I had and get away with it. But look at you now. You're finished, Greg. And this? This is only the beginning. Rachel." The next morning, I drove by the house, just in time to see Greg leaving. He looked haggard, his clothes rumpled and his face pale. He carried a single suitcase, the last remnants of his once grand life. I parked a few houses down and watched as he got into his car and drove away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Greg was gone, and the house was one step closer to being mine again. But I wasn't naive. I knew the fight wasn't over. There were still legal hurdles to clear, and I would have to prove that Greg had stolen the house from me. But now, I had the money, the resources, and the determination to see it through. Greg had tried to destroy me, but in the end, he had only destroyed himself. And I wasn't done yet. Not until I got everything back. I was so close. After months of planning, scheming, and carefully dismantling Greg's life, the house was almost mine again. My lawyer had managed to reopen the case, armed with the evidence I'd gathered to prove Greg's forgery. Between the fraudulent deed, Greg's bankruptcy, and the mountain of financial ruin he'd brought on himself, it felt like the tide was finally turning in my favor. Justice was within reach. But life has a funny way of throwing you a curveball when you least expect it. 2 weeks before the final court hearing, I got a call from my lawyer. I was expecting good news, maybe even a settlement offer from Greg's camp. Instead, what I heard stopped me in my tracks. "Rachel," my lawyer began, her voice tense. "We just received some new information, and it's not good." My stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "There's another claim on the house," she said. "A man named Daniel Olson, Greg's brother, has filed paperwork stating he has partial ownership. Apparently, Greg sold him a stake in the property right before his bankruptcy." I froze. "What? That doesn't even make sense. Greg doesn't own the house legally, he forged the deed. How can his brother claim it?" My lawyer sighed. "It's complicated. The court will still need to determine the validity of the original deed. But in the meantime, Daniel's claim muddies the waters. This could drag the case out for months, maybe even years." I was furious. It was just another scheme, another attempt by Greg to cling to what wasn't his. And now, he dragged his brother into it. I didn't know much about Daniel, but if he was anything like Greg, I could only imagine the kind of trouble he'd bring. Still, I refused to back down. I wasn't about to let some stranger waltz in and take what was rightfully mine. So, I did what I did best, I started digging. Daniel Olson was nothing like Greg. Where Greg was flashy and arrogant, Daniel was quiet and unassuming. He lived in a modest house across town and worked as a carpenter. There was no sign of the greed or scheming that defined his brother. At first, I couldn't understand why he would get involved in something like this. But then I found out something that made my blood run cold. Daniel wasn't just Greg's brother. He was my dad's son. It was buried deep in the county records, a birth certificate from 1978, listing my father as Daniel's father. My dad had another child, years before he married my mom, and he'd never told me. Suddenly, Everything clicked. Daniel wasn't just some random guy looking to cash in on Greg's schemes. He was my half-brother. And if this went to court, he might actually have a legitimate claim to the house. I didn't know what to do. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me all over again. My dad had kept this secret for decades, never once mentioning Daniel or the fact that I had another sibling. Why hadn't he told me? Did he even know Daniel existed? And why was Daniel working with Greg, the man who had ruined my life? I decided to confront him. I tracked him down to the woodworking shop where he worked and showed up unannounced one afternoon. When I walked in, he looked up from the table he was working on, his expression cautious but kind. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. I took a deep breath. "You're Daniel Olson, right?" He nodded. "Yeah. Who's asking?" "I'm Rachel," I said, my voice shaking. I'm your sister." Daniel froze, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Our dad was Robert Evans," I said quickly, pulling the birth certificate from my bag and sliding it across the table. "I found this. I don't know if you knew, but he was my father too." Daniel stared at the paper for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he set it down and looked up at me. "I knew," he said quietly. "I've known for a long time." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You knew? Then why didn't you ever try to contact me? Why now, after all these years, are you suddenly trying to take my dad's house?" Daniel frowned. "I never wanted the house. That was Greg's idea. He told me about the forgery, about everything he did to you. He said he needed my help to keep you from getting it back." "Why would you help him?" I demanded. "He's a liar and a thief. He ruined my life." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because he's my brother, Rachel. And he told me he was desperate. He said he had no choice. I didn't know the whole story until now. I swear, if I'd known what he did to you, I never would have agreed to this." I wanted to believe him. There was something sincere about the way he spoke, something that felt familiar. Like my dad. But I wasn't ready to trust him, not yet. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I began to unravel the mess Greg had created. It turned out Greg hadn't just forged the deed, he'd also used Daniel's name and signature to create a false claim of co-ownership, without Daniel's full understanding of what he was signing. When Daniel found out, he was furious. He cut ties with Greg and agreed to help me prove the forgery in court. But the biggest bombshell came just days before the final hearing. I got a call from Daniel late one night. His voice was tense. "Rachel, you need to come to my house. Now." When I arrived, Daniel was waiting for me with a stack of old letters in his hands. "I found these in a box my mom kept," he said, handing them to me. "They're from your dad. I think you should see them." I sat down and began reading. The letters were heartbreaking. My dad had written to Daniel's mother for years, apologizing for not being in Daniel's life. He talked about how much he regretted the decisions he'd made, how he wanted to make things right but didn't know how. And then there was one letter, written just a month before my dad's death, that changed everything. In the letter, my dad revealed that he had tried to reach out to Daniel one last time. He wanted to bring him back into his life, to introduce him to me and make us a family. And then came the most shocking part, my dad had offered Daniel the house. He wrote, "I've already transferred the deed to Rachel's name, but I want you to have a share of it. It's only fair. You're my son, and you deserve something, too. Rachel will understand, she's kind, like her mother. I'm hoping this house can bring us all together." I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. My dad hadn't betrayed me. He hadn't lied to me. He'd been trying to bring us together, to leave something behind for both of us. And Greg. Greg had destroyed all of it. At the hearing, Daniel testified against Greg, exposing the forgery and revealing everything Greg had done. The court ruled in my favor, returning the house to me and declaring Greg's claims invalid. But I didn't feel victorious. The house was mine again, but it was tainted by everything that had happened. After the hearing, Daniel and I stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the past few months hanging heavy between us. "I don't want anything from you," he said quietly. "I just want you to know I'm sorry. For everything." I looked at him, my half-brother, a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. "You deserve a part of it," I said. "Dad wanted us to share it. Maybe we can figure out a way to make that work." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'd like that." As for Greg, he disappeared after the hearing. Word around town was that he fled to another state, broke and humiliated. I didn't care where he went. I had my house back, and maybe, just maybe, I'd gain something else, too. Because in the end, revenge wasn't what gave me closure. It was the truth, and the chance to build something new. Something my dad would have wanted.